Hello, and welcome to a discussion about how we can make London's streets safer for women. I'm delighted to be joined by three illustrious panelists. We have Nimco Ali. She's a writer, a campaigner, and an independent government advisor who specialises on tackling violence against women and girls. Also delighted to have Soma Sarah. Soma's the founder of the platform Everyone's Invited, which allows people to share their stories anonymously about their own accounts of sexual harassment and abuse. And last but not least, delighted to be joined by Jake Saunders, who's a workshop leader and a former youth board member of Tender, which is an arts-based charity working to prevent domestic violence and sexual violence in the lives of children and young people. So welcome all. It's a really, really important moment as we reflect following the disappearance and death of Sarah Everard. There have been so many discussions on platforms like this, in newspapers and magazines, and most importantly, just between friends, family, about this terrible, terrible tragedy. And it has really shone a light on the issue of femicide and also the spectrum of sexual harassment and sexual violence against women and girls. So this is going to be a really, really important discussion. Nimco, I'd like to come to you first. You're an independent advisor to the government on violence against women and girls. You have called the death of Sarah Everard a watershed moment. What are you advising the government in terms of what their priorities should be now?
Thank you very much. I'm not here speaking specifically for the government, but speaking as an independent advisor and as a feminist myself. My key advice to the government is to listen to women, and that's why we reopened the government's consultation on violence against women and girls after the death of Sarah Everard. We had over 250,000 responses, and it's really ensuring that each and every one of those is heard and listened to.
And it does feel like it's a watershed moment, Nimco. So many women have been sort of talking about it. What do you think? What do you feel in your conversations with women and different groups? What are the sort of action points that people are gravitating towards?
I think it's really fundamentally acknowledging that there is a problem and there's a broken social contract. 50% of the population of this country, women, 50% of the population of London are living a complete different reality to the other 50%. And it's about having real conversations and actually saying that there needs to be different forms of legislation in order to prevent that. And I feel for myself as well that there is a moment of real truth and reconciliation, because beyond before the Sarah Everard death, there was also Me Too. But what we did not have in Me Too was the reality of really holding accountable men who are still living within our society, who are people perpetrators or people who have committed forms of violence against women and girls.
Mm. Thank you for that. Soma, Sarah, I want to bring you in now. You launched Everyone's Invited in June 2020, and it's a really interesting platform because you allow people to share their stories anonymously. And the reaction to it has been really, really overwhelming. What prompted you to set that up? And did you anticipate this kind of the response that you've had?
I set up the platform, as you say, back in June, and it was after I'd had many conversations with friends throughout both my teenage years and university, and we just realized that so many of us had these experiences of rape culture and sexual violence and abuse growing up. And these were, in the most part, hidden experiences that we weren't sharing with each other or with the adults or parents in our lives at the time. And so I decided to share my own experiences on Instagram. And I was immediately overwhelmed with just so many stories from people in my life, people I'd met growing up, new friends and old friends, all reaching out to tell me how much they resonated with everything that I was saying about rape culture, as well as also sharing their own testimonies and stories of sexual violence and abuse and harassment and everything really within the spectrum of rape culture. And I really felt compelled in that moment to create a more permanent platform. Everyone's invited for survivors to share their stories, to amplify their voices, but also to provide a community of solidarity and allowing them a sense of catharsis and healing. And I've just been building up that platform over the past 10 months. And it was on the 8th of March where I asked, I reinvited our community to resubmit their stories, and it really just went viral.
And what impact do you think, Soma, has the death of Sarah Everard had on the work that you're doing with Everyone's Invited?
I think this conversation and rape culture has always existed, and it was going on. I started the platform back in June, but this is a problem that is an archaic, age-old problem. I think right now it is, a moment where people are listening and hearing survivors.
Yeah, it does feel like it is, as Nimco said, this watershed moment. It's a watershed moment for all of us. Certainly women of all ages are having conversations with their friends, their mothers, their grandmothers, their daughters, their granddaughters, their nieces. It's such a huge conversation. But of course, a lot of this starts with young people, Jake. And I want to come to you about the work you've done with Tender, because in your charity, you've been looking at creative ways to work with young people to educate them about gendered violence. Just tell us a wee bit about the sort of work that you do on a practical level.
Sure. So the moment you go into a school with the words gendered violence or sexual assault or sexual harassment, you're often very, very quickly met with terrified looking faces, perhaps fairly so, because parents don't necessarily want to expose their children to such difficult conversations at a young age. But what Tender and organizations like Tender do is they try and start those conversations in a really accessible way. And we know that arts, specifically drama, has always been used and has been shown to be effective as a tool to start really difficult conversations. Tender since 2003 has been going into community groups, schools, and engaging young people from primary age all the way up to now university work in age appropriate and accessible conversations about the topics that we're talking about here. That might well be from sort of running sessions about personal boundaries, perhaps, or healthy and unhealthy behaviors in friendships with like the very young ones, all the way through to having more serious and explicit conversations about the sort of rampant sexual violence that's permitted, has been permitted on our university campuses. So through all of those different age ranges, it's using the arts as a tool, as a key to start having those conversations with young boys and girls in the same room together, so that everyone can start to be on the same page about what is and what isn't healthy in relationships and in terms of men's attitude towards women.
And Jake, you've introduced that really, really important factor, because a lot of women are having these conversations, but we're not going to get change if it is just women having these conversations. And Jake, in the work that you do, particularly with young boys, how do they respond to the topics that you're bringing in? Do they accept it? Is there pushback? Is there any sense of young boys feeling demonized at all?
It's an interesting one, because the honest answer is not really in schools, because the whole point of Tender's sort of values really is that it's a preventative model. And I think that that's something that's really, really needed at the moment, is trying to stop these behaviors and attitudes before they develop into something more serious. And we often find that by engaging young men, young boys in these conversations in an interesting, a slightly different way to what they're used to in school, they're really starting to open up and explore how they themselves can make a difference. in terms of feeling demonized, I think it's perhaps the wrong word. Uncomfortable, perhaps, yes. But I think that there's something really important in feeling uncomfortable, because we can't deny the fact that this very much is a gendered issue, and it's very easy for boys to switch off from the conversation by saying, "Oh, hang on a minute, that doesn't apply to me," than it is to actually sort of invite them into the conversation, have it in an accessible way, and then leave them with the tools to be able to go on and do something about it. So, no, to answer your question, I don't see much pushback in schools. Yes, there's an occasional sort of giggle or a slight visible uncomfortability in the room when you start having conversations about things like sex and relationships, which is inevitable. Anyone who sat in a sex education class in school will know that that's inevitable. But when you actually start getting into the meat of the conversations, no, it's overwhelmingly just productive conversations.
And Nimco, bringing you into this, I mean, having these conversations with boys and men of all ages is incredibly important. But there has been some pushback to it. There has been a lot of, well, hang on a minute, not all men, don't tar us all with the same brush. You know, what's been your reaction to that, and how do we navigate that in terms of making positive culture change?
Yeah, not the all men hashtag is quite problematic, and women who have been in this space have not said all men, they've just said the word men, but all men have a collective responsibility in order to be able to talk about these issues within the spaces that they inhabit. So ultimately, I do believe that men have a massive role to play, and I say, as a feminist who has 4 brothers and is heterosexual, we have to navigate this world with men, so there needs to also be a space for redemption and understanding that some kind of violent behavior is learned, and as a society we have a role to play in that. So yeah, ultimately I do believe that men have a massive role to play in terms of ending violence against women and girls, because we have to be able to collectively work together in order to achieve a safer society.
Yeah, it's really interesting that the not all men hashtag has been very prevalent, but you know, Soma, as your experience, particularly through Everyone's Invited, has showed, pretty much every woman and every girl has had some experience. Would you say now that you think rape culture and sexual harassment is endemic in Britain's schools and colleges?
I think rape culture is an issue that's universal. I think it exists in all schools and all universities and all of society. And I'd really like to echo what the others are saying, in that boys absolutely, and men have, they should have a place in this conversation. But it's not just about educating men and boys, it's also about educating girls and women. It's about everyone having these conversations, having the empathy to listen to survivors, to understand, because I know it's difficult to come to terms with, but I do believe that all of us do play a part or have been complicit in this culture. And that's because, it's a product of the way we were socialized, the way we were brought up. It's how our environment, it's how it was. So it's really important that we acknowledge this if we want to move forward and shift the culture. It's about reassessing and addressing those deeply entrenched sexist attitudes and beliefs that are, in many cases, internalized or subconscious in many of us.
And Soma, one of the things that I've been really struck with in the work that you've been doing, and the sort of leadership you've been showing in this area, you've been quite careful about saying this is not just about retribution, this is not just about naming and shaming people. Can you just explain a bit more to us about that? Because we do live in an age where understandably there's a lot of anger, there's a lot of rage. We live in an era of cancel culture as well. So just talk us through your kind of philosophy on this side of things.
Yes, we are anti-cancel culture. And the reason for this is we believe that, if we're pointing our fingers at a demographic or an institution or an individual, you're actually narrowing the problem, and you're not acknowledging that you're making it seem like it only exists in one place or in one person, when really this is a cultural issue. It's completely widespread and it's very pervasive, and it's about acknowledging and addressing the web and wider web of abuse in society at large, and how everyone is complicit in allowing it to occur. And it's really important, again, to emphasize empathy and reconciliation. And as Nimco said, having that space for redemption is so crucially important. We must acknowledge that we're all human beings at the end of the day, and we cannot reduce people to a one-dimensional existence. People are capable of doing good things and bad things, and we all deserve a chance to learn and do better.
And Nimco, just coming back to you, I mean, speaking of sort of redemption and forgiveness, there has been a lot of anger directed at the Metropolitan Police because of how particularly the vigil after Sarah Everard was conducted. But there is generally a sense of mistrust that a lot of women have with the police and the criminal justice system at the moment. I spoke to a lot of women who were at the vigil who said that actually they didn't feel comfortable reporting things to the police. I spoke to rape prosecution barristers who said it was really, really hard to get a conviction. What do you think needs to be done to try and build that trust up again between the criminal justice system and women?
I think there has to be a collective change at all levels, and police officers are sourced from the same society which actually upholds rape culture, and so are the jury services and so on. So I do think that we do actually need a drawing up of a new social contract to understand that even if it's not the actual act of violence happening to you, but it's the fear of violence, and women's lives are being corroded on a day-to-day basis because of the fact that they fear sexual or physical violence. I was at a meeting called by the Prime Minister after the death of Sarah Everard, and there was a commitment from the judiciary, there was a commitment from the government in order to do things differently, but that needs to be fed in from the results of all the recommendations that we receive from women in the open call for evidence. So I have my personal views, but ultimately I think there should be something that really represents all women rather than just what I think.
Yeah. And do you feel that there really is an appetite in government right now to listen and most importantly to take action?
Yeah, no, I definitely think that there is, and we also can't be complacent because, today that there's news about the Super League, and that seems to be something that everybody's reacting on and doing things quite quickly on. We have to be able to use this watershed moment in order to really push for real legislative change, but also social change. We are as human beings, we are social animals, and a lot of the things that are happening is because we've just normalized the idea of rape culture. And when we've normalized the ways that boys have behaved, there's another hashtag on Twitter at the moment called "We Cannot Consent" or "We Did Not Consent." If you read some of the things that are happening to women within the conversation of sexual relationships that haven't been reported as rape or sexual violence, it's quite horrific. So I do think we have a long way to go, but we have started the journey.
They've certainly started a conversation. And Jake, Saunders, just picking up on that point that Nimco made, that there is obviously the legislative parts of the story. There's the criminal justice system, which is incredibly important in all of this. But there is the sort of social side of things and what has conditioned our society to send a signal which says that rape culture is okay, that there's this hypersexualization of women and girls, often a violent hypersexualization. Where do you think that has come from? Has that come from popular culture? Does pornography have a role to play with that, particularly when technology collides with that, because everybody can access everything on their phones now? What do you pick up when you work with young people, particularly young men?
I don't think that you can deny that these kind of things like access to pornography, the media, of course, have an impact. But I think the problems arise when you start to try and pinpoint exactly what that moment is, or exactly what that thing is, because as Soma said, we're not that simple. As human beings, we are three-dimensional, and there's often so many different things that make us who we are. And the moment that we start to say it's my access to pornography, or it's my the media that I consume, that often feels like a bit of an excuse, really. Everybody is ultimately in control of their choices and the decisions that they make. And yes, we might be conditioned to look at things a certain way or behave a certain way because we've seen it modeled in our parents, teachers, around us all the time. But I'd say that my message, I suppose, to young men and boys is that you don't have to follow that message. You have a choice that is very much yours and an individual choice to make, to do the right thing, to call your friends out, even though it makes you uncomfortable, even if it makes you uncool. You have the choice to not make those comments. You have the choice to not touch that person inappropriately. And I think, yes, we can try and focus the conversations on society and what we have to do, but there also needs to be a degree of accountability. And individuals do need to accept that we are individually contributing to this culture.
And Jake, with the work you've done as well, have you had much feedback from parents about what they feel their responsibilities are, or their natural anxieties, parents of both boys and girls?
Well, doesn't tend to work too much with parents, but from other workshops and other organisations that I've worked for, where I have worked with parents, there does seem to be a fear, and I think again it's that feeling of, oh, maybe it's my actions, maybe it's my responsibility that my child is acting in this way or speaking in this way. And there's that fear there that parents don't necessarily want to engage in that conversation just in case the finger gets pointed at them, which is fair enough. I mean, we do live in a culture and a society where that does tend to happen. People tend to jump on people and sort of rip them to pieces, so to speak, and it's fair enough to be scared of that. But you also have to accept that if your child has done something wrong, there needs to be accountability for that. And if you are having to be a part of that accountability by talking to your child and making them understand how what they've done is wrong, then that should be encouraged. And perhaps investment needs to be made in organisations that are building the tools to allow parents to have those conversations with their kids, because perhaps there's a lack there as well.
And Soma, in terms of the interaction you've had with schools, because I think schools and colleges and universities have really been quite rocked by the reaction that your platform has had. What are the things that headmasters and mistresses and people in leadership positions are do you get the impression that they are beginning to take this seriously? And what can be done in schools and colleges and universities on a practical level?
Yes, I do get the impression that they're taking things very seriously, and we're so encouraged to see that crucial dialogue existing and going on between their pupils and heads and leaders across the country. I think it's so important, and really continuing that conversation and giving space to listen to survivors of these behaviours is so important. I think across the board, in terms of practical things, it's really important to prioritise the survivor moving forward and make sure that we're creating spaces that they feel listened to and that they're believed and that they're supported. And yeah.
Excellent. And Nimco, just coming back to you in terms of some of the practical things that can be done. There's a lot of kind of legislation that can be looked at. What about things like street harassment as a crime, and things like curb crawling and those kind of like street level offences? Do you think things could be tougher in terms of the criminal law?
Yeah, so I say this from a personal perspective, that I do support criminalizing on sexual harassment on on the streets. It's just unacceptable for young women to be walking the streets of their city and to be having to listen to such graphic things the things I've heard. And I walk around the city and I see more legislation or more punitive measures taken against littering than there is against women being sexually harassed on on the streets. So I do definitely support the idea of the fact of legislating against sexual harassment on the streets of London and beyond.
And the government recently said that they were going to pilot looking at making misogyny a hate crime. Is that something that you support?
Do you know what? I understand the concept of where that came from, but it's not something that I support, and it's not something that I've heard the support from women who work within the violence against women and girls, the violence against women and girls sector. And I think it can lead to this conversation about really just like, making things which are gender specific criminal. I think we have to be able to take practical steps that actually contribute to a safer and better world for all. And one thing that I would like to add is the fact that when we talk about things like sexual violence and toxic masculinity's role in that is also killing men as well. So more young people are taking their lives because of the way that we've constructed the idea of what it is to be a man. That leads to sexual violence, but that also leads to them feeling like that they can't fit into society. So I'm quite skeptical about the idea of making misogyny a hate crime, but I'm here to listen and learn.
And Nimco, just another thing I just wanted to raise with you. There's been a lot of discussion, particularly after the Sarah Everard case, about things like, is enough attention paid to women's safety and things like urban planning and urban design, from well-lit streets to, there's actually quite a controversial discussion raging about low traffic neighbourhoods, and is that going to make things more difficult for women? What do you think about that? Where do you think the balance lies? Because as ever with politics and policy making, it's competing priorities. There's lots of people who, for very good reasons, want to really cut back, for example, on having lots of traffic in city centres late at night or at any time. But then for women, getting a cab home at night is often a godsend. Where does the balance, how do you get the balance right, do you think?
I think we can't balance the safety of women. We are humans. We are 50% of this city. We just need more women around the table. I think many of those kind of pathetic decisions are sometimes being made because there are few women on the around the table. I remember being in the middle of Soho like a year and a half ago with my niece just before lockdown, and they had put out mobile urinals out for men to urinate in, and I just thought, I'm walking on the pavement with a 9-year-old and there are men with their legally allowed to have their genitals out. I ended up emailing the council and saying, like, how is this acceptable? And they said, well, if we don't put these urinals out, then they're going to urinate on shops, and shops are complaining. That's a public order offence. Women do not go around the city of London go into the toilet anywhere they want, and then we don't deal with that by actually allowing men to have the access to basically flash young children and women. So I do honestly think that we need more women within the planning permission committees, and we need more women in politics, and I'm 100% behind that. So I think that's the only way that we can really address these things, is to have more people that are representatives of the communities that public policy is serving, part of those public policy teams, as it were.
Yeah. No, I absolutely agree with that. From my time in politics, I absolutely agree with you on that. There's very few women in the room. There's very few people from different backgrounds. Now, we've just got a couple of minutes left, and I just want to end this really fascinating, thoughtful, smart discussion by just going around and asking, look, everyone is understandably angry about the situation, upset about the situation, depressed about the situation. I want you to leave us with one note of optimism, something that we can take away, which is a sort of positive. Soma, I'm going to start with you.
Well, I'd like to say that it's been incredible and so uplifting to see so many women and just everyone really engage in these conversations. It's so moving to see the bravery of so many survivors come forward. And everyone's invited. We'd really like to encourage the importance of empathy and reconciliation moving forward.
Thank you. Jake?
I think charities such as Tender are bringing to the table such creative solutions to these difficult conversations. And I think that the more and more that happens, the more that these voices of quite small organisations are brought into the mainstream, the better. There are also specialist services like Gallup, and Jewish Women's Aid, who are working every single day behind the scenes, supporting the women, supporting survivors of sexual abuse, sexual violence, and those organisations should be absolutely celebrated for the work that they've done. They're bringing such unique perspectives to the conversation that this conversation can't really happen without.
And Nimco, your final a note of optimism to leave us on.
So I just want to say, as a survivor, I just want to say to all of the survivors that I believe you and that we are here to support you, and ultimately progress is possible. And I do believe that this watershed moment is an opportunity for us to be able to make real difference. So I'm hopeful about the fact that we will be able to allow women to live free of fear from sexual violence, as opposed to just ending sexual violence itself.
Well, thank you so much to my three brilliant panelists, Nimco Ali, Soma Sarah, and Jake Saunders. A really, really interesting discussion. Thank you.